unaware her late mother left her $40 million. Her husband filed for divorce and threw his pregnant wife out on Christmas Day to marry his mistress. "Eleanor, I've already filed for divorce." "You're leaving tonight," he said calmly over dessert, then turned to his family. "Everyone, this is Victoria, my fiancée. She'll be taking Eleanor's seat." 6 months pregnant, she stood and walked out into the December snow. What he didn't know, her mother had just left her $40 million and control over the banks, financing his entire empire. He thought he'd thrown away a powerless woman. What she did next with that inheritance destroyed everything he built. But how did a silent, dismissed wife bring down an empire without them ever seeing it coming? Hello, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. John Stories. Before we begin, please subscribe to my channel. It costs nothing, but it means everything to this family. Comment the time and where you're watching from, so we know you're here with us. Now let's get into the story. Eleanor's hand trembled as she reached for the crystal water glass, and she knew her mother-in-law had seen it. Margaret's eyes, sharp as a hawk watching prey, tracked every movement Eleanor made across the dining table. The chandelier above cast golden light on faces that had perfected the art of cruelty wrapped in Christmas cheer, and Eleanor understood with absolute clarity that tonight would be no different than the 100 nights before it. She was 6 months pregnant, her belly round and obvious beneath the navy dress she'd chosen carefully that morning, hoping the conservative cut would earn her some measure of respect. It hadn't. Nothing ever did. "Eleanor, darling." Margaret's voice sliced through the low murmur of conversation, sweet and venomous in equal measure. "You're slouching again. A lady carries herself with grace, especially when she's carrying a child. Posture, dear. Posture." The word hung in the air like an accusation. Around the table, Richard's sister Emma smirked into her wine glass, while his brother Thomas coughed to hide a laugh. Eleanor straightened her spine without responding, her jaw tight, her hands moving to rest on the white tablecloth. She'd learned silence was safer than defense. Any attempt to explain, to justify, to stand up for herself only fed their appetite for her humiliation. "I was just reaching for water," Eleanor said quietly, her voice steady despite the heat crawling up her neck. Margaret smiled, the kind of smile that never reached her eyes, the kind that made Eleanor feel like an insect under glass. "Of course you were, dear. I'm simply trying to help. You didn't grow up with these expectations, so it's natural you'd need guidance." The implication landed like a slap. Eleanor hadn't been born into this world of wealth and carefully maintained appearances. Her mother had raised her alone, working long hours as a bookkeeper, teaching Eleanor that dignity came from within, that patience was strength, that silence could be a weapon if you knew how to wield it. But her mother was gone now, buried just 2 weeks ago in a small ceremony that Richard had attended for exactly 45 minutes before returning to his office. The grief was still fresh, a raw wound that throbbed with every breath, made worse by the fact that nobody in this family had acknowledged her loss beyond a perfunctory card. Richard sat beside her, cutting his prime rib with surgical precision, his face a mask of careful neutrality that Eleanor had learned to read like a language. He wasn't ignoring the conversation. He was orchestrating it with his silence, allowing his mother's cruelty to flow unchecked. His presence beside Eleanor a statement of ownership rather than partnership. Every so often his eyes would flick toward her, measuring her reaction, cataloging her discomfort with the same detached interest a scientist might observe a specimen. Eleanor had caught that look before in smaller moments, in private arguments where his voice never rose, but his words cut deep. He enjoyed this. Not openly, not with obvious malice, but with a quiet satisfaction that was somehow worse. "The roast is lovely, Margaret," Emma said, her fork scraping against fine china. "Your recipe never fails." "Eleanor, did you help with the cooking?" The question was designed to corner her. If she said yes, they'd find something to criticize. If she said no, she'd be lazy. Eleanor had learned this game 3 Christmases ago when she'd first married into this family and realized too late that acceptance would never come. "I made the side dishes," she answered carefully. Thomas laughed outright this time. "That explains the potatoes." They're a bit hard, aren't they? Did you forget to boil them long enough? Eleanor's fingers tightened around her fork, but her face remained calm. I followed the timing exactly. Margaret waved a dismissive hand, her diamond bracelet catching the light. Cooking takes instinct, dear, not just following instructions. Some people have it naturally. Others have to work at it. The conversation moved on, flowing around Eleanor like she was furniture, necessary for the room to be complete but unremarkable in every way. They discussed holiday plans she wasn't included in, referenced inside jokes she'd never be part of, laughed at memories from before she existed in their world. Richard participated fully, his voice warm with his family, cold silence returning whenever Eleanor tried to contribute. At one point, she mentioned the baby's recent ultrasound, hoping maternal interest might bridge some gap, but Margaret simply nodded and redirected attention to Emma's recent promotion at work. The message was clear. Eleanor's pregnancy was an obligation they tolerated, not a joy they celebrated. Have you ever sat at a table surrounded by people who treated you like you were invisible? Have you ever wondered how long you could endure before you broke? The meal continued in this rhythm of small cruelties, each one carefully measured to sting without being overtly cruel, designed so that if Eleanor ever tried to explain to an outsider why these dinners hurt, her complaints would sound petty, oversensitive, and unreasonable. That was the genius of it. Margaret had perfected the art of inflicting pain while maintaining plausible deniability, and she'd taught her children well. Emma's comments about Eleanor's appearance, always framed as concern. Thomas's jokes at her expense, always delivered with a smile. Richard's silence, always explained away as his quiet nature rather than calculated abandonment. And through it all, Eleanor sat with her hands folded, her back straight, her face composed, cataloging every slight, every insult, every moment of dismissal in a mental ledger she didn't yet know she'd one day collect on. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, soft but firm. Patience isn't weakness, Eleanor. It's preparation. Watch. Listen. Remember. People reveal themselves if you give them time. Eleanor had thought she understood that lesson, but sitting here now, feeling the weight of her unborn child and the fresh grief of her mother's death, she was beginning to understand it on a different level. These people believed her silence meant submission. They interpreted her patience as proof of powerlessness. They had no idea they were teaching her exactly who they were, building a perfect record of their own cruelty that would one day serve as the foundation for their undoing. More wine, everyone? Richard's voice cut through her thoughts. He stood, moving around the table, with the bottle, filling glasses with practiced ease. When he reached Eleanor, he didn't pause, didn't ask, simply moved past her to fill his mother's glass. Can't have any in your condition, he said without looking back, as if she'd asked, as if she'd been denied something she wanted rather than simply erased from consideration. It was a small thing, meaningless in isolation, but combined with everything else, it formed a pattern Eleanor was beginning to see clearly. She wasn't a wife to Richard. She was a mistake he was managing, a problem he was solving in slow motion, a burden his family resented, and he'd learned to resent too. The candles on the table flickered, casting dancing shadows across faces flushed with wine and satisfaction. Christmas music played softly from hidden speakers, classic carols that spoke of peace and goodwill. The irony, so thick Eleanor could taste it. She glanced toward the kitchen where dessert was being prepared, could see the outline of the chocolate cake through the doorway, could smell cinnamon and sugar mixing with the pine scent of the massive tree dominating the corner of the dining room. Everything about this evening was designed to look perfect from the outside. The decorations, the food, the well-dressed family gathered in celebration. But Eleanor knew the truth beneath the surface. This wasn't a family. It was a performance. And she was the prop they used to prove their superiority. What Eleanor didn't know, couldn't know, as she sat there enduring another round of subtle humiliation, was that dessert would bring more than cake. She didn't know that Richard had been waiting all evening for this exact moment, that his silence had been rehearsed, that every glance he'd given her had been measuring her one final time before he delivered the blow he'd been planning for weeks. She didn't know that in less than 30 minutes, she'd be standing alone in the December cold, cast out like garbage, her entire world shattered by words spoken calmly over chocolate and cinnamon. But she would remember this feeling. This moment of sitting at a table surrounded by cruelty disguised as family. Because it was the last moment before everything changed. The last moment she'd ever let anyone make her feel small. The last time she'd sit silently while people who knew nothing about strength mistook her patience for weakness. Eleanor's hand moved to her belly, feeling her baby move beneath her palm, and something hardened inside her chest. Not anger. Not yet. But a quiet understanding that survival required more than endurance. It required observation, memory, preparation. Her mother had left her something in that sealed envelope. Something Eleanor hadn't yet opened, because the instructions said to wait until she truly needed it. Sitting here now, feeling the weight of contempt pressing down on her from every direction, Eleanor wondered if that moment had finally arrived. The dessert arrived on a silver platter, the chocolate cake perfectly layered and decorated with delicate frosting rosettes that caught the candlelight. Eleanor watched as Margaret cut precise slices, each portion measured with the same exacting standards she applied to everything in her controlled world. The aroma of chocolate and cinnamon filled the dining room, mixing with the tension that Eleanor could feel building in her chest, though she couldn't name why. She accepted her plate with a quiet thank you, lifting her fork to take a small bite, the sweetness coating her tongue while her mind catalogued the evening's humiliations with the same careful precision her mother had taught her. Richard shifted beside her, and she felt rather than see the change in his posture, the way he straightened as if preparing for something, his hand moving to adjust his wine glass with deliberate slowness. "Before we finish tonight, I have an announcement to make," Richard said, his voice cutting through the soft Christmas music with startling clarity. The table fell silent. Emma looked up from her dessert with curiosity. Thomas set down his fork, and Margaret's eyes gleamed with something Eleanor recognized, but couldn't find a quiet place. Satisfaction. Anticipation. As if she'd been waiting for this moment all evening. Richard didn't look at Eleanor as he spoke, his gaze fixed somewhere over her shoulder, his words delivered with the same calm precision he used in business meetings. "I've filed for divorce. The papers were submitted 3 days ago. Eleanor will be leaving tonight." The words landed like physical blows, each syllable a hammer striking Eleanor's chest. She sat frozen, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth, her mind struggling to process what she'd just heard. Filed for divorce. 3 days ago. While she'd been planning this dinner, while she'd been cooking and preparing and trying desperately to earn even a scrap of acceptance, he'd been dismantling their marriage with the clinical efficiency of a man discarding broken equipment. "Richard, what are you?" Eleanor's voice came out smaller than she intended, barely a whisper against the ringing in her ears. He turned to her then, his face completely composed, no anger, no guilt, no emotion whatsoever. "It's been decided, Eleanor. The marriage isn't working. I think we both know that." Margaret reached across the table to pat her son's hand, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "It's for the best, dear. Some things simply aren't meant to be. You'll understand in time." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, her hand instinctively moving to her pregnant belly, as if to shield her child from the cruelty unfolding around them. "I'm 6 months pregnant with your child, Richard. You're doing this on Christmas Eve." Emma laughed, actually laughed, the sound sharp and bright in the suffocating silence. "Oh, Eleanor, always so dramatic. Richard is being completely reasonable. Surely you can see this marriage has been a disaster from the start." Thomas nodded in agreement, lifting his wine glass in a mock toast. "Better now than later. Clean break. You'll thank him eventually." Eleanor looked around the table at faces that showed no sympathy, no shock, no discomfort with the cruelty being inflicted. They'd known. All of them had known this was coming, had sat through dinner watching her serve them, watching her endure their insults, knowing that Richard would deliver this final humiliation before the night ended. The realization hit harder than the announcement itself. This had been planned, orchestrated, designed specifically to maximize her pain and their sense of power over her. "There's someone else," Richard continued, as casually as if he were discussing the weather. "Someone more suited to my life, my family, my expectations. She'll be joining us shortly, actually. I thought it appropriate to introduce you before you leave." Eleanor's vision blurred at the edges, her breath coming in short gasps as she fought to maintain composure. Someone else. He had someone else. While she'd been pregnant with his child, while she'd been mourning her mother, while she'd been trying desperately to be enough for this family, he'd been building a replacement life behind her back. Have you ever been publicly humiliated by someone you trusted? Have you ever felt your entire world collapse in a single moment? The doorbell rang, its cheerful chime obscene against the devastation unfolding in the dining room. Richard stood smoothly, adjusting his jacket with the same practiced ease he'd shown all evening. "That will be her now. I trust you'll be civil, Eleanor. There's no need to make this more difficult than it needs to be." He walked toward the foyer, leaving Eleanor sitting at the table surrounded by his family, their eyes on her like predators watching wounded prey. Margaret's smile was radiant, victorious. "You really should have tried harder, dear. Richard needs a partner who understands his world, who can navigate society properly. You were never going to be that person." Eleanor's hands trembled as she set down her fork, the chocolate cake suddenly making her stomach turn. She could hear voices in the foyer, Richard's warm greeting, a woman's bright laughter, the sound of a coat being removed. Then they appeared in the doorway, and Eleanor felt something inside her chest crack and shatter. The woman was young, polished, her blonde hair styled perfectly, her red dress elegant and expensive. She moved with the confidence of someone who'd never been made to feel small, who'd never had to fight for space in a room. Richard's hand rested possessively on her lower back as he guided her toward the table. "Everyone, this is Victoria," Richard announced, his voice filled with warmth that Eleanor had never heard directed at her. "My fiancée." The word hung in the air, impossible and absolute. Fiancée. Not a girlfriend. Not a new relationship. Fiancée. Which meant this had been going on for months, maybe longer, planned and executed while Eleanor had been living in their home, sleeping beside him, carrying his child. Victoria smiled at the table, her expression friendly and completely unbothered by the pregnant wife she was replacing. "It's wonderful to finally meet you all properly. Richard has told me so much about his family." She glanced at Eleanor, her smile never wavering. "And you must be Eleanor. Richard mentioned you'd be here tonight." What an awkward situation, but I suppose it's better to be straightforward about these things. Margaret stood immediately, moving to embrace Victoria with genuine warmth. "We're so delighted Richard has found someone suitable. Please sit here." She gestured to Eleanor's chair, the chair Eleanor was still sitting in. The implications were staggering in their cruelty. Not just replacement, but immediate, complete erasure. Eleanor was expected to simply vacate her seat, her place, her life, and watch as this stranger stepped into the space still warm from her presence. "I'm still sitting here," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the chaos roaring inside her head. Richard's expression hardened, the first crack in his careful composure. "Then stand up, Eleanor. You're leaving anyway. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Emma leaned back in her chair, clearly enjoying the spectacle. "Come on, Eleanor. Show some dignity. You've lost. Accept it gracefully." The word dignity nearly broke her. These people who'd spent years stripping away every shred of her self-respect were now lecturing her about dignity. Eleanor rose slowly, her leg shaking, her hand pressed against the table for balance. She looked at Richard, really looked at him, searching for any trace of the man she'd married, the man who'd promised to love her, to build a life with her. She found nothing but cold calculation, a stranger wearing her husband's face. "The baby," Eleanor whispered, her hand on her belly. "What about the baby?" Richard's jaw tightened, the only sign of discomfort he'd shown all evening. "We'll discuss custody arrangements through lawyers. I'll provide financial support as required by law. But you need to understand, Eleanor, that this child doesn't change anything between us. The marriage is over." Victoria touched Richard's arm gently, her voice soft. "I'm sure we can all be reasonable about this. Children need stability, and Richard will certainly be a wonderful father." The presumption in her words, the casual claim to Eleanor's child's future, ignited something hot and fierce in Eleanor's chest. But she swallowed it down, forced herself to breathe, forced herself to think clearly through the panic and pain. Margaret picked up Eleanor's dessert plate, handing it to Victoria with theatrical grace. "Here, dear, you must try this. It's my special recipe." Victoria accepted it with a warm smile, sitting in Eleanor's chair as if she'd always belonged there, as if Eleanor had been nothing but a temporary inconvenience, now being corrected. The family resumed eating, conversation flowing around the table as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if they hadn't just destroyed a woman's life over chocolate cake and Christmas carols. Eleanor stood beside the table, invisible now, her role in this family concluded, her presence no longer required or acknowledged. "I'll have someone bring your things to you," Richard said without looking at her, cutting into his own dessert with steady hands. "You should have enough clothing and personal items to manage for now. Anything else can be arranged through the lawyers." Eleanor wanted to scream, to overturn the table, to demand answers and apologies and some acknowledgement of the cruelty being inflicted. But her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "Patience isn't weakness, Eleanor. Watch. Listen. Remember." So she did. She watched Richard's hand on Victoria's shoulder, watched Margaret's triumphant smile, watched Emma and Thomas exchange satisfied glances. She listened to their laughter as conversation resumed, to the clinking of forks and china, to the Christmas music that continued playing as if joy still existed in this room. And she remembered every word, every gesture, every moment of calculated cruelty. "I'll go," Eleanor said quietly, her voice cutting through their conversation. She walked toward the foyer with deliberate steps, her spine straight despite the trembling in her legs. Her coat hung near the door. The navy wool she'd worn arriving at this dinner now felt like it had happened years ago instead of hours. She put it on slowly, her fingers fumbling with the buttons, the December cold already seeping through the walls. Behind her, she heard the family's conversation continue, heard Victoria's laughter blend with Margaret's approval, heard Richard's voice warm and engaged in ways it had never been with Eleanor. The front door was heavy oak, the handle cold against her palm. She pulled it open, and winter air rushed in, sharp and biting, stealing her breath. Eleanor stepped onto the front porch, the door closing behind her with a soft click that sounded like finality. Snow had begun to fall, soft white flakes drifting down from the black sky, settling on the manicured lawn and expensive cars in the driveway. The Christmas lights strung along the house's exterior cast colored shadows across the snow, festive and beautiful and completely at odds with the devastation crushing Eleanor's chest. She walked down the steps carefully, one hand on her belly, one hand gripping the railing, her breath coming out in white clouds. The cold bit through her coat immediately, making her gasp, but she kept walking, moving toward the street, because standing still meant collapsing, and she couldn't collapse. Not here. Not where they could see. Could you have walked away with your dignity intact? Could you have stayed silent when everything inside you wanted to scream? Eleanor reached the sidewalk and stopped, turning back to look at the house that had been her home for 3 years. Light spilled from every window, warm and golden, the perfect picture of holiday joy. Inside, they were celebrating her absence, toasting her replacement, moving forward as if she'd never existed. Eleanor's hand moved to her coat pocket, fingers brushing against the envelope her mother had left her, the one with instructions not to open until she truly needed it. Standing here in the snow, pregnant and homeless, and publicly humiliated on Christmas Eve, Eleanor understood that moment had arrived. She didn't open it yet. Some truths required privacy, and whatever her mother had left her deserved more than a sidewalk reading while snow fell and her former family celebrated behind lit windows. But Eleanor knew, with absolute certainty, that the woman they'd just dismissed as weak and powerless was about to discover something that would change everything. The humiliation she'd endured tonight wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of a reckoning none of them could imagine. Eleanor turned away from the house and began walking into the December night, each step taking her further from the life she'd known and closer to a future she couldn't yet see, but somehow felt waiting for her in the darkness ahead. Eleanor sat in the tiny motel room 3 blocks from the hospital, Her mother's envelope spread open on the cheap laminate desk, and understood for the first time that her entire life had been preparation for this exact moment. The letter was written in her mother's careful handwriting, dated 2 months before her death, every word deliberate and measured in ways Eleanor was only beginning to comprehend. "My dearest Eleanor," it began, "if you're reading this, then you've finally encountered a situation where patience alone isn't enough, where you need more than strength of character to survive. I've spent my life teaching you to observe, to wait, to endure, but I never told you why. The truth is, I wasn't just a bookkeeper scraping by to raise you. I was building something far greater than either of us, and now it's yours." Eleanor's hands trembled as she read further, her eyes scanning words that rewrote everything she believed about her childhood, her mother's sacrifices, the quiet life they'd lived in their small apartment, while Eleanor had watched other children enjoy luxuries she'd never dreamed of having. Her mother had been investing systematically and strategically for 30 years. Every dollar saved, every opportunity seized, every calculated risk taken with the patience of someone who understood that real wealth wasn't built quickly, but constructed piece by careful piece over decades. The numbers listed in the attached documents made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. $40 million. Properties in prime locations across 3 states. Investment portfolios diversified across industries her mother had researched meticulously. Legal structures so carefully designed that no challenge could penetrate them. No claim could touch them. No divorce proceeding could access them because they'd been established long before Eleanor had ever met Richard. "I never told you because I needed you to learn what it meant to have nothing," her mother had written. "I needed you to understand humiliation, to experience powerlessness, to develop the patience and observation skills that would make you worthy of this legacy. Wealth given to someone who hasn't earned wisdom is just money waiting to be lost. But wealth is placed in the hands of someone who's endured, who's learned, who's watched and waited and understood human nature at its worst. That's power that can change everything." Eleanor set down the letter, her vision blurring with tears that were equal parts grief and revelation. Her mother had watched her suffer, had known about the cruel family Eleanor had married into, had attended that wedding and seen the warning signs, and had chosen not to intervene because she believed Eleanor needed to learn these lessons firsthand. The realization was devastating and empowering in equal measure. The motel room was cold despite the rattling heater in the corner, the walls thin enough that Eleanor could hear conversations from neighboring rooms, the whole place smelling of industrial cleaner and old cigarettes. She'd paid for 3 nights using the small amount of cash in her wallet, knowing she needed time to process everything, to make sense of the documents spread before her, to understand the full scope of what her mother had left her. The baby kicked inside her belly, a sharp reminder that she wasn't just planning for herself anymore, but for a child who deserved better than the life Richard had tried to relegate them to. Eleanor's hand moved across the property deeds, each one representing buildings and land she now owned outright. A commercial complex in downtown Chicago, residential properties in Austin, a shopping center in Denver. Her mother's notes were attached to each deed, explaining the purchase rationale, the income they generated, and the strategic importance of their locations. "You're not powerless, Eleanor," the letter continued in her mother's steady script. "You never were. Every moment you spent enduring cruelty, you were learning. Every insult you cataloged, you were gathering intelligence. Every time you stayed silent while they treated you as insignificant, you were becoming invisible to them, which is the most dangerous thing an enemy can be. Now you have the resources to act, but remember everything I taught you. Patience, observation, precision. The powerful destroy themselves if you give them enough rope and enough time." Eleanor read that passage 3 times, understanding clicking into place like tumblers in a lock. Her mother hadn't just left her money. She'd left her strategy, a framework for justice that required no confrontation, no dramatic gestures, just careful application of resources combined with the intelligence Eleanor had been gathering for 3 years. Have you ever discovered that everything you thought you knew about your life was carefully orchestrated preparation? Have you ever held power in your hands and understood exactly how dangerous you become? The investment portfolios were even more impressive than the real estate. Her mother had bought into technology companies before they exploded, had divested from industries before they collapsed, had maintained a level of financial sophistication that spoke to hours of research and study Eleanor had never witnessed. "I did this work at night while you slept," one note explained. "I studied markets, read reports, and analyzed trends. I wanted you to have a normal childhood, to not feel the weight of what I was building. But I was always building, Eleanor. Always preparing for the day you'd need this." Eleanor spread the documents across the narrow bed, organizing them by category, her mind already beginning to map connections between the assets and opportunities they represented. One property deed caught her attention, a commercial building in the same neighborhood where Richard's family business operated. Her mother had purchased it 8 months ago, which meant she'd been researching Richard's world, identifying pressure points, creating strategic positions, even as her health declined. Eleanor picked up her phone. The screen cracked from when she dropped it during the walk from Richard's house to this motel, and dialed the number listed at the bottom of her mother's letter. It rang twice before a man answered, his voice professional and measured. "Morrison & Associates, Harold Morrison speaking." Eleanor took a breath, steadying herself. "Mr. Morrison, this is Eleanor Chun. My mother was Grace Chun. I'm calling about her estate." There was a pause, then warmth flooded his voice. "Eleanor, I've been expecting your call. Your mother spoke. You often. I'm deeply sorry for your loss, and I'm here to help you understand everything she built." They arranged to meet the following morning at his office downtown, Morrison assuring her that all the documents were in order, that everything had been structured specifically to ensure Eleanor's complete control, and that he'd been working with her mother for over a decade to create the legal framework that now protected her inheritance. "Your mother was brilliant," Morrison said before ending the call. "She understood something most people never grasp, that real power isn't loud or obvious. It's quiet, strategic, and absolutely unassailable when constructed properly. You're going to be just fine, Eleanor. Better than fine." Eleanor set down the phone and returned to the documents, pulling out a yellow legal pad from her bag and beginning to take notes, connecting dots between properties and opportunities, between Richard's vulnerabilities and her newfound resources. The commercial building near his family business was just the beginning. Looking through the portfolio, she found investments in companies that supplied his business, property ownership that controlled access to resources he needed, strategic positions her mother had established that Eleanor could now leverage with surgical precision. The baby kicked again, stronger this time, and Eleanor placed both hands on her belly, speaking quietly to the life growing inside her. "Your grandmother left us more than money. She left us the tools to ensure you never grow up powerless, never have to endure what I endured, never have to stay silent while people treat you as insignificant." Eleanor's voice caught on the words, grief and determination mixing in her chest. "She taught me patience, and now she's given me resources. Together, they're going to change everything." Eleanor spent the next 4 hours reviewing every document, every property deed, every investment statement, building a comprehensive understanding of the empire her mother had quietly constructed. The work was meticulous, each asset chosen deliberately, each investment timed strategically. Nothing was random. Everything had a purpose. And slowly, Eleanor began to see the larger pattern, the web of influence and control her mother had woven that now belonged to her. By midnight, Eleanor had filled 12 pages with notes, connections, and initial strategies. She understood now why her mother had waited, why she'd let Eleanor marry Richard, why she'd watched her daughter suffer without intervening. Because Eleanor had needed to see these people clearly, to understand their patterns, to catalog their weaknesses, while they dismissed her as powerless. They'd spent 3 years teaching her exactly how to destroy them, showing her every vulnerability, every point of pride that could become a pressure point, every assumption that could be weaponized against them. And they'd done it all while believing she was too weak, too insignificant to matter. The mistake was breathtaking in its completeness. Eleanor stood and walked to the motel window, pulling back the thin curtain to look out at the parking lot where snow continued to fall under flickering streetlights. Somewhere across the city, Richard was probably in bed with Victoria, celebrating his freedom, believing he'd successfully discarded the burden of his failing marriage. His mother was likely pleased with herself, satisfied that she'd finally rid her son of the unsuitable wife who'd never belonged in their world. They were all sleeping peacefully tonight, confident in their power, secure in their dominance. They had no idea that the woman they'd thrown out into the snow was standing in a cheap motel room, holding documents that gave her control over $40 million and strategic positions they didn't know existed. They had no idea that every insult they'd delivered, every humiliation they'd inflicted, had been observed and recorded by someone who now had the resources to turn their cruelty into consequences they couldn't imagine. Eleanor turned back to the desk, picking up her mother's letter one more time, reading the final paragraph that had been circled in red ink. Don't act immediately, Eleanor. That's crucial. Let them believe they've won. Let them celebrate. Let them grow comfortable and confident in their victory. Use this time to observe more, to position yourself strategically, to build an understanding of their operations and vulnerabilities. The more secure they feel, the more devastating it will be when you finally act. Remember, patience isn't waiting. It's preparation. And you've been preparing your entire life for what comes next. Eleanor folded the letter carefully, placing it back in the envelope alongside the documents she'd returned to the safe deposit box Morrison would provide. Her mother was right. Acting now in the heat of pain and anger would waste the advantage of surprise. Better to move slowly, deliberately, invisibly. Better to let Richard and his family believe she'd been broken, defeated, removed from their lives permanently. What would you do with $40 million and a family that had no idea you'd just become their worst nightmare? Would you strike immediately, or would you wait for the perfect moment? Eleanor returned to the bed, organizing the documents back into neat stacks, her mind already beginning to plan the weeks and months ahead. She needed to establish her position quietly, to begin shifting pieces on the board without alerting anyone to the game being played. She needed to understand Richard's business completely, his family's financial dependencies, the relationships and contracts that sustained their lifestyle. Her mother had given her the resources, but Eleanor had to supply the strategy, the timing, the precision that would turn potential power into actual justice. The baby kicked again, and Eleanor smiled for the first time since the Christmas Eve disaster, a small, private smile that contained no joy but absolute certainty. "We're going to be fine," she whispered to her unborn child. "Better than fine. We're going to show them what happens when they mistake patience for weakness, when they confuse silence with powerlessness, when they believe that cruelty comes without consequences." Eleanor turned off the lamp, lying back on the motel bed in darkness, listening to the sounds of traffic outside and voices through thin walls. Tomorrow she'd meet with Morrison, begin the process of taking full control of her inheritance, and start building the framework for what came next. But tonight, in this small room that smelled of other people's lives and temporary existence, Eleanor Chun transformed from a discarded wife into something far more dangerous. A woman with resources, intelligence, patience, and a perfect understanding of her enemy's weaknesses. The Christmas Eve betrayal that had seemed like her destruction was actually her liberation, the final lesson she'd needed before stepping into power her mother had spent a lifetime building. And Richard, Victoria, Margaret, and the rest of that cruel family had absolutely no idea what was coming for them. Eleanor stood at the edge of the charity gala, a glass of sparkling water in her hand, watching Richard work the room with the same confident charm he'd displayed throughout their marriage. 2 months had passed since Christmas Eve, 2 months since she'd been thrown out into the snow, and now she stood 7 months pregnant in a simple black dress that cost more than Richard would ever guess, observing him with eyes that saw everything he didn't want to see. He had no idea she was there. The invitation had come through one of the shell companies her mother had established, a corporate donor to the Children's Hospital Fund that gave Eleanor access to events where Boston's elite gathered to display their wealth and generosity. She'd positioned herself near a marble column, partially obscured by the crowd, her presence unremarkable to everyone except the people she was studying with surgical precision. Victoria stood beside Richard, her hand on his arm, her red dress catching light as she laughed at something a silver-haired businessman had said. She looked comfortable in this world, her confidence natural and unforced, exactly the kind of woman Margaret had always wanted for her son. Eleanor watched Richard lean in to whisper something in Victoria's ear, watched the intimate gesture that spoke of ownership and pride, and felt nothing but cold calculation. He thought he'd upgraded. He thought he'd traded burden for blessing. He had no idea he'd actually traded security for exposure, stability for vulnerability, and that the quiet woman he'd dismissed was cataloging every mistake he made with the patience of someone who knew exactly how to use information. Richard Sterling, isn't it? The businessman extended his hand, his voice carrying across the space between them. I've heard impressive things about your family's real estate development company. That project downtown is generating quite a buzz. Richard's smile widened, his posture straightening with pride. Thank you. We've worked hard to establish Sterling Development as a premier name in commercial real estate. My mother and I have built something really special over the past 15 years. Eleanor's pen moved across the small notebook concealed in her clutch, recording the name of the businessman the project referenced, the casual arrogance in Richard's voice that suggested he believed success was permanent and unassailable. She'd spent the past 8 weeks doing exactly this, attending events, listening to conversations, building a comprehensive map of Richard's business operations and the family's financial dependencies. Harold Morrison had been instrumental in teaching her how to observe strategically. Don't just watch what they do, he'd explained during one of their weekly meetings at his downtown office. Watch what they assume, what they take for granted, where they're overextended because they've never had to worry about consequences. Eleanor had learned quickly, her natural patience combining with newfound resources to create a surveillance operation that was both invisible and comprehensive. She knew now that Sterling Development was leveraged heavily, that Richard's recent projects depended on credit lines from 3 specific banks, that his mother's personal wealth was tied up in investments that looked stable but were actually vulnerable to market shifts that Eleanor could potentially influence. Margaret appeared beside Richard, her elegant navy gown making her look regal and untouchable, her hand gesturing as she spoke to a couple Eleanor recognized from society pages. The key to successful development is understanding the community, Margaret said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never been questioned. We don't just build structures. We create environments where people want to live and work. That's why Sterling Development has maintained its reputation for over a decade. Eleanor noted the pride in Margaret's posture, the way she commanded space and attention, the absolute confidence that came from years of dominance, unchallenged. It was the same confidence she displayed at that Christmas dinner. The same certainty that her judgment was final and her power permanent. Eleanor understood now that confidence like that was built on foundations that could be dismantled if you knew where to apply pressure. Have you ever watched someone celebrate their victory over you while you quietly planned their downfall? Have you ever been underestimated so completely that it became your greatest advantage? Eleanor moved through the gala with practiced invisibility, her pregnant form making her seem vulnerable and unthreatening, exactly the impression she wanted to create. She paused near clusters of conversation, listening to businessmen discuss contracts and investments, to society women gossip about families and finances, to the casual exchanges that revealed vulnerabilities and dependencies people never guarded in social settings. She learned that the Hancock Tower project Richard had mentioned was actually behind schedule and over budget. She discovered that Margaret's brother, who served on Sterling Development Board, was quietly concerned about the company's debt-to-equity ratio. She heard Victoria mention wedding plans for June, the same month Eleanor's baby was due, the timing a calculated insult that revealed how little thought they'd given to the child they'd so easily dismissed. Eleanor. The voice came from behind her, shocked and uncertain. Eleanor turned to find Emma, Richard's sister, staring at her with wide eyes. What are you doing here? Richard said you'd left the state after the divorce. Eleanor smiled, the expression calm and measured, showing nothing of the strategic calculations running through her mind. I'm still in Boston, Emma. I have business here. The baby's due in 2 months, and I want to be near good medical facilities. Emma's eyes swept over Eleanor's dress, the expensive fabric and expert tailoring clearly registering. You look well. I thought. She stopped, seeming to realize the implications of what she'd been about to say. That she thought Eleanor would be broken, struggling, desperate. You thought I'd be destroyed? Eleanor finished the sentence gently, watching Emma's face flush. I'm managing fine, Emma. Better than fine, actually. Your brother's support has been adequate. The lie came easily, natural as breathing. Richard hadn't sent a single dollar since Christmas Eve, but Emma didn't need to know that. What she needed to believe was that Eleanor was surviving on Richard's limited charity, that she remained dependent and powerless. Emma nodded, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. That's good. I'm glad you're okay. Richard will be happy to hear it. He was worried you might try to make things difficult with the divorce. Eleanor's smile never wavered. Why would I make things difficult? Richard made his choice. I'm simply focused on my child and moving forward. There's no point in fighting battles that are already lost. Emma relaxed visibly, the response exactly what she'd wanted to hear. That's very mature of you, Eleanor. I always thought you were reasonable, even if things didn't work out. She glanced over her shoulder toward where Richard stood with Victoria. I should get back. Take care of yourself. She walked away, and Eleanor resumed her observation, knowing that Emma would report this encounter to Richard, that he'd be reassured by Eleanor's apparent acceptance, that his confidence would grow even stronger. Perfect. Every interaction like this reinforced their belief that she was defeated, cooperative, no longer a concern. And every day they believed that lie, Eleanor gained more information, more strategic position, more understanding of how to dismantle everything they'd built. The gala continued around her, champagne flowing and laughter rising above orchestral music. Boston's elite gathered to celebrate their generosity while demonstrating their wealth. Eleanor watched Richard accept congratulations on his engagement, watched Margaret hold court among society matrons, watched Thomas and Emma circulate with the easy confidence of people who'd never faced real consequences. She cataloged every interaction, every business connection mentioned, every casual comment about investments and contracts. The notebook in her clutch is filled with names, companies, relationships, dependencies. By the end of the evening, Eleanor would have added 30 new entries to the database she was building, 30 more pieces of the puzzle that would eventually reveal exactly how to bring sterling development and the family's financial security crashing down. Excuse me, miss? A waiter appeared at Eleanor's elbow, offering champagne from a silver tray. Eleanor shook her head, indicating her pregnancy, and the waiter nodded apologetically before moving on. The small exchange reminded her of her physical vulnerability, of the child growing inside her who depended on her patience and precision. Every decision she made now affected 2 lives, which meant she couldn't afford mistakes, couldn't let anger or pain drive her actions. Her mother's letter had been clear. Emotion was the enemy of strategy, patience was power, and victory belonged to those who could endure discomfort without breaking formation. Eleanor glanced at her watch, noting it was nearly 10. She'd gathered enough information for tonight, observed enough patterns, reinforced enough false beliefs about her powerlessness. Time to leave before Richard or Margaret noticed her presence and started asking questions she wasn't ready to answer. She made her way toward the exit, moving through the crowd with the same careful invisibility she'd maintained all evening. Just another pregnant woman leaving early, unremarkable and easily forgotten. But as she reached the marble foyer, she paused, turning back for one final look at the glittering ballroom, where Boston's elite celebrated their success and dominance. Richard stood in the center of a group, his arm around Victoria, his face animated as he told some story that had his audience laughing. Margaret stood nearby, her expression satisfied and proud, surrounded by women who deferred to her judgment and sought her approval. Thomas and Emma worked different sections of the room, their social skills polished and effective, their family name opening doors and creating opportunities. They looked untouchable, invincible, secure in their power and position. They looked exactly like people who had no idea they were being systematically dismantled by someone they dismissed as irrelevant. Would you have the patience to watch your enemies celebrate while you quietly destroyed the ground beneath their feet? Would you have the strength to smile and play weak while building weapons they couldn't see? Eleanor pushed through the heavy doors into the cold February night, her breath misting in the air as she descended the museum steps toward the street where her car waited. She'd purchased the vehicle 2 weeks ago, a modest sedan that drew no attention, paid for in cash through one of the accounts Morrison had established. Everything about her new life was designed for invisibility, for the appearance of struggling survival, while actual power grew in darkness. She drove through Boston streets, passing buildings she now owned without anyone knowing, properties her mother had purchased that now generated income Richard's family would never suspect existed. Eleanor had studied every asset carefully, understanding not just their financial value, but their strategic position in the larger game she was playing. At a red light, her phone buzzed with a text from Morrison. Documents finalized. You now have full voting rights on the Meridian Holdings board. Sterling Development's primary lender. Let me know when you want to proceed to the next phase. Eleanor read the message twice, understanding the implications completely. Meridian Holdings controlled credit access for half the major developments in Boston, including every project Sterling Development currently had in progress. Her mother had purchased a controlling interest 5 years ago, hidden behind corporate structures so complex that no casual investigation would ever reveal the connection. And now Eleanor controlled those voting rights, which meant she controlled whether Sterling Development continued to receive the financing that kept their projects alive. Eleanor deleted the message and continued driving, her mind already mapping the next steps, the careful sequence of moves that would tighten pressure without revealing her hand too early. Everything had to appear natural, inevitable, just unfortunate timing and market forces beyond anyone's control. By the time Richard understood what was happening, it would be too late to stop, too late to adjust, too late to do anything except watch his carefully constructed world collapse around him. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, and Eleanor placed one hand on her belly, speaking quietly in the darkness of her car. Your father thinks he won. He thinks he traded us for something better, that he made the smart choice, the profitable choice. He has no idea that the biggest mistake of his life was teaching me exactly who he was, showing me every weakness, assuming I was too powerless to matter. Eleanor pulled into the parking lot of her small apartment, the modest building another carefully chosen element of her disguise. But we know the truth now, don't we? We know that patience is power, that observation is a weapon, and that people who celebrate cruelty always underestimate the consequences coming for them. Eleanor sat across from Harold Morrison in his downtown office, a wall of legal books behind him and contracts spread across the mahogany desk between them, while outside the March wind rattled windows and sent rain streaking down glass that reflected the gray Boston sky. She was 8 months pregnant now, her body heavy and uncomfortable, but her mind had never been sharper. Every detail of the plan she was building crystallized with a clarity that came from months of patient observation and strategic positioning. Morrison adjusted his reading glasses, pointing to a clause in one of the documents with his pen, his voice measured and professional in the way of lawyers who'd seen enough battles to respect the ones worth fighting. This gives you complete authority over Meridian Holdings' lending decisions, Morrison explained, tapping the paper. Your mother structured it so that no vote can proceed without your approval. Sterling Development's current credit line comes up for renewal in 4 months. If you choose not to approve the extension, they'll need to find alternative financing within 30 days or face default on 3 major projects. Eleanor leaned forward despite her bulk, studying the numbers Morrison had highlighted. What are the chances they'd find alternative financing in that time frame? Morrison's expression was grim. With their current debt ratios and the way they've leveraged their assets, minimal. Most lenders would see them as too risky, especially if word got out that Meridian declined to renew. It would signal problems that would make other banks nervous. Eleanor sat back, her hand moving to her belly where the baby pressed against her ribs, the life inside her a constant reminder that this wasn't about revenge, but about justice. About building a future where her child would never know the powerlessness she'd experienced. I don't want to move yet. Not until after the baby is born. I need to maintain focus, and I can't risk any complications affecting my health or the pregnancy. Morrison nodded approvingly. That's wise. It also gives us more time to shore up every legal position, to ensure that when you do act, there's no avenue for challenge, no loophole they can exploit. Patience has served you well so far, Eleanor. It will serve you even better in the months ahead. They spent the next 2 hours reviewing documents, Morrison walking Eleanor through property deeds and investment portfolios with the thoroughness of someone who understood that precision mattered, that one overlooked detail could unravel months of careful planning. Eleanor asked questions constantly, her legal pad filling with notes, her understanding deepening with each explanation. She learned that her mother had established trusts that couldn't be touched by divorce proceedings, had created corporate structures that separated personal wealth from business operations, had built financial fortifications so complete that Richard's lawyers would find nothing to claim even if they suspected Eleanor had resources beyond what she disclosed. Your mother thought of everything, Morrison said at one point, with genuine admiration in his voice. I've been practicing law for 30 years, and I've never seen someone plan this meticulously. She knew you'd need protection, knew you'd need power, and she made absolutely certain that when the time came, you'd have both. Eleanor felt tears threaten but pushed them back, maintaining the control her mother had taught her. She let me suffer. She watched me marry Richard, watched his family treat me terribly, and never intervened. I understand why now, but it still hurts. Morrison's expression softened. She explained it to me once. Said that someone who'd never been powerless could never truly understand how to wield power responsibly. That you needed to learn what it felt like to have nothing, so you'd never take for granted what it meant to have everything. Have you ever been grateful for suffering because it taught you lessons you couldn't have learned any other way? Have you ever understood that sometimes the people who love you most let you struggle because they're preparing you for something greater? Eleanor gathered the documents back into folders, organizing them with the same careful precision she applied to everything now. I need to know more about Sterling Development's operations. Not just the financial side, but the practical details. Which projects are critical, which relationships are essential, where the real vulnerabilities exist beyond just the credit lines. Morrison pulled out another file, this one thicker than the others. I anticipated that. I've had investigators compile detailed reports on every active project, every key relationship, every contractual obligation. Sterling Development looks solid from the outside, but they've been operating on increasingly thin margins for the past 18 months. Richard's been chasing bigger projects to maintain growth, which means he's taken on debt that requires those projects to succeed. If even one major development fails, the whole structure becomes unstable. Eleanor opened the file, scanning pages of information that read like a roadmap to destruction, every vulnerability highlighted, every pressure point identified. She saw that the Hancock Tower project was hemorrhaging money due to construction delays and supplier disputes. She learned that Sterling Development had guaranteed completion dates with penalty clauses that would trigger massive financial consequences if deadlines were missed. She discovered that Margaret's personal fortune was largely invested in the company, which meant the family's wealth was concentrated in an asset that was far more fragile than their confidence suggested. The more Eleanor read, the clearer the pattern became. Richard had built an empire that looked impressive, but was actually sustained by constant forward momentum, by always landing the next big deal that paid for the last one. It was a house of cards disguised as a fortress, and all it would take was removing one critical support to bring the entire structure crashing down. The suppliers for the Hancock project, Eleanor said, finding a particular section in the report. It says here that Sterling Development is in dispute with 3 of them over payment terms. Morrison nodded. They've been slow paying to preserve cash flow, which has created tension. The suppliers have threatened to halt work if payments aren't brought current within 60 days. Eleanor's mind raced through implications, seeing connections Morrison might not have intended. What if those suppliers had an alternative buyer for their services? Someone who paid promptly and offered better terms. Morrison's eyebrows rose. The suppliers would likely prioritize that relationship which could leave Sterling Development without critical resources exactly when they need them most. But finding such a buyer would require someone with both capital and strategic interest in the construction market. Eleanor met his eyes directly. My mother's portfolio includes a construction supply company, doesn't it? Small enough that Richard wouldn't know about it, but positioned to serve the Boston market. Morrison pulled up a file on his computer, scrolling through records before nodding slowly. Chun Industrial Supply. Your mother purchased it 6 years ago, restructured the management, and it's been quietly profitable ever since. The company specializes in materials for commercial development. Eleanor felt pieces clicking into place with satisfying precision. What would it take to have Chun Industrial approach Sterling Development suppliers with offers they couldn't refuse? Better payment terms, volume guarantees, the kind of security that makes switching clients worth the temporary disruption. Morrison was already taking notes, his legal mind clearly engaged by the strategy. It would require careful timing and absolutely airtight contracts, so Sterling couldn't claim interference. But if Chun Industrial was simply expanding its client base through aggressive but legitimate business practices, there'd be no legal recourse. Eleanor nodded, filing the idea away for future implementation. Not yet. Not until after the baby comes and I'm certain about timing. But I want the groundwork laid, so when I'm ready, it can happen quickly. She paused, considering the next element. What about the board members at Sterling Development? How secure is Richard's position? Morrison pulled out yet another file, his preparation impressive in its completeness. Richard controls 45% of voting shares. His mother Margaret controls another 30%. The remaining 25% is split between his Uncle James and 2 non-family board members who've been with the company since the beginning. Eleanor studied the breakdown, seeing opportunity in the division. So if Margaret turned against Richard, or if the non-family members lost confidence, his control would become vulnerable. Morrison nodded carefully. In theory, yes. But Margaret has always supported Richard completely. Turning her would require something catastrophic that damaged her faith in his judgment. And the board members have been loyal for years. They'd need compelling reasons to break ranks. Eleanor thought about Margaret's pride, about the way she valued reputation and social standing above everything else, about how completely she'd supported Richard's decision to divorce Eleanor and marry Victoria. What if Richard's business decisions started creating public embarrassment? What if projects failed in ways that reflected badly on the Sterling name? Would Margaret prioritize protecting her son or protecting the family reputation she spent decades building? Morrison leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing at his lips. Now you're thinking strategically. Margaret's greatest vulnerability is her social standing. She serves on charity boards, hosts society events, and trades on the Sterling name's prestige. If that reputation became tarnished, if their financial troubles became public knowledge, if she faced embarrassment among her peers, her support for Richard might waver. Would you have the patience to build a plan for this complex, to consider every angle, to wait for the perfect moment when everything aligned? Would you have the strength to play the long game when immediate action felt so tempting? They continued working through details until early afternoon, Eleanor's understanding of the financial and social landscape deepening with each document reviewed, each strategy discussed. By the time she left Morrison's office, she carried with her not just folders of legal documents, but a comprehensive mental map of how to dismantle Richard's world piece by careful piece, how to apply pressure at multiple points simultaneously so that no single action could be identified as attack, but the cumulative effect would be devastating. She drove back to her modest apartment through rain that had turned to drizzle, her windshield wipers beating a steady rhythm that matched the calculations running through her mind. The apartment was small and unremarkable, a one-bedroom in a decent but not wealthy neighborhood. The kind of place that suggested someone managing unlimited means rather than someone controlling $40 million. Eleanor had chosen it deliberately, paying 6 months' rent in advance through a checking account that showed only modest deposits from what appeared to be child support payments. Everything about her visible life was designed to reinforce Richard's belief that she was struggling, dependent, no longer relevant to his world. The furniture was second-hand, but clean. The nursery she'd set up in the corner of the bedroom, filled with practical items, purchased from discount stores. If Richard ever bothered to check on her, which he hadn't, he'd find exactly what he expected. A woman barely managing, grateful for whatever minimal support he provided, focused entirely on survival. But in the locked drawer of her desk, hidden beneath files that looked like job applications and baby-related paperwork, Eleanor kept the real records. Spreadsheets tracking Sterling Development's vulnerabilities. Timelines for when various pressures would reach critical points. Lists of relationships she could leverage, contracts she could influence, decisions she could affect without ever revealing her hand. Every week she added new information, refined her understanding, adjusted her strategy based on what she observed and what Morrison's investigators uncovered. The plan was becoming more sophisticated, more complete, more absolutely certain to succeed with every day that passed. Eleanor made tea and sat at her small kitchen table, her body tired from the pregnancy's late stages, but her mind energized by the morning's work. She pulled out her legal pad, reviewing the notes she'd taken, adding thoughts and connections in the margins. The baby kicked hard, and Eleanor placed her hand over the movement, feeling her daughter's strength through skin and muscle. "Just a few more weeks," she whispered. "Then you'll be here, and I'll be able to focus completely on making sure you never grow up powerless, never face what I faced, never have to smile while people treat you as insignificant." The rain intensified outside, water streaming down windows. The gray afternoon light making the apartment feel isolated and protected, a haven where Eleanor could plan without observation, where she could be honest about her intentions, without pretense or performance. She thought about Richard at that moment, probably in his office reviewing architectural plans or meeting with investors, confident in his success, secure in his belief that divorcing Eleanor had been the right decision, that Victoria was the upgrade he deserved, that his mother's judgment had been correct as always. He had no idea that the woman he'd thrown away on Christmas Eve was sitting in a modest apartment, planning the systematic dismantling of everything he'd built, using resources he didn't know existed and patience he'd mistaken for weakness. The irony was so complete, it almost made Eleanor smile. Almost. But smiling implied joy. And what Eleanor felt was something colder, more focused, the absolute certainty that comes from understanding exactly what needs to be done and having both the means and the will to do it. Eleanor's phone buzzed with a text from Morrison. Contracts ready for Chun industrial expansion. Legal team standing by for your approval. Everything is in place whenever you're ready to proceed. Eleanor typed back a single word. Soon. She set down the phone and returned to her notes, reviewing timelines and dependencies, making sure every element was positioned correctly, that no action would be premature, that when she finally moved it would be with the force of inevitability rather than the chaos of impulse. Her mother had taught her that patience was power, and Eleanor was about to prove that lesson in ways that would echo long after the immediate consequences had settled. The quiet months of planning were almost over. The storm she'd been building in silence was nearly ready to break. Eleanor's daughter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late April, 6 pounds and 8 ounces of perfect innocence that changed everything and nothing simultaneously. She named her Grace, after the mother who'd prepared this path, and as she held her newborn in the hospital room's quiet darkness, Eleanor understood with absolute clarity that every decision from this moment forward would be measured against one question. What kind of world would Grace inherit? The baby's tiny fingers wrapped around Eleanor's thumb with surprising strength, and Eleanor made a silent promise that her daughter would never know powerlessness, would never sit at a table and learn to make herself small, would never mistake cruelty for family or abuse for love. Richard sent flowers 3 days after the birth, an expensive arrangement delivered to Eleanor's apartment with a card that read simply, "Congratulations on your daughter." No visit, no phone call, no acknowledgement that he'd just become a father or that Eleanor had gone through labor alone while he'd been planning his June wedding to Victoria. The flowers sat on Eleanor's kitchen counter for 2 days before she threw them away, their beauty irrelevant compared to the message they sent. That Grace was an obligation Richard would fulfill financially, but never emotionally. that his role as father would be limited to support payments and nothing more. Eleanor had expected nothing different, but seeing the confirmation still carved a hollow space in her chest that had nothing to do with her own feelings and everything to do with what her daughter would never have. He doesn't deserve to know her, Eleanor whispered to Grace during a midnight feeding, the apartment quiet except for the baby's soft sounds and the distant traffic outside. He threw us away like we were nothing, and now he gets to play happy family with Victoria while pretending you don't exist except as a line item on his financial obligations. Grace's dark eyes stared up at Eleanor with the unfocused gaze of newborns, and Eleanor felt her resolve harden into something unbreakable. But that's okay, sweetheart, because we don't need him. We never did. And by the time I'm done, he'll understand exactly what he lost and exactly what it cost him. The first 2 weeks after Grace's birth passed in a blur of sleepless nights and constant feedings, Eleanor's body recovering while her mind cataloged the time passing, knowing that each day brought her closer to being ready to act. Morrison called regularly, always respectful of her need to focus on the baby, but keeping her updated on developments she needed to know. Sterling Development's credit line renewal was now 3 months away. The Hancock Tower project was another month behind schedule with penalties mounting. 2 of Richard's major suppliers had quietly accepted contracts with Chun Industrial Supply, though the full impact of that shift wouldn't be felt for several weeks. Everything was positioned exactly as planned, pieces moving into place with the patient inevitability of a strategy that had been months in the making. Have you ever held your newborn child and known that the world you were bringing them into needed to be fundamentally changed? Have you ever felt love and rage exist simultaneously, each making the other more powerful? By the 3rd week, Eleanor had established a routine that allowed her to begin working again. Grace sleeping in a bassinet beside her desk, while Eleanor reviewed documents and updated her strategic plans with one eye always on her daughter. She'd hired a small team through Morrison, professionals who didn't know Eleanor's identity, but worked efficiently to implement the various elements of her strategy under corporate structures that concealed her involvement. Chun Industrial Supply continued its aggressive expansion into Sterling Development's supply chain. Shell companies Eleanor controlled began making strategic property purchases in areas where Richard had planned future developments. Not enough to be obvious, but sufficient to complicate his zoning applications and increase his costs. Financial analyst Morrison had retained started quietly circulating reports about commercial real estate market vulnerabilities that specifically highlighted risks in the sectors where Sterling Development was most heavily invested. None of these actions alone would be devastating. That was the genius of Eleanor's approach. Each move was defensible as normal business activity, motivated by legitimate interests rather than personal vendetta. But together, they created pressure from multiple directions simultaneously, stress that would accumulate and compound until Sterling Development found itself struggling against problems that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Market forces rather than deliberate attack. Eleanor had learned from her mother that the most effective revenge didn't announce itself, didn't provide a clear target for counterattack, but arrived like weather, inevitable and impossible to stop once the conditions had been established. Eleanor's phone rang one afternoon in early May, the screen showing Emma's name. She considered letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity won. "Hello, Emma." There was a pause. Then Emma's voice came through uncertain and almost apologetic. "Eleanor, hi. I hope I'm not bothering you. I just wanted to see how you're doing. And if the baby came okay." Eleanor glanced at Grace, sleeping peacefully in her bassinet. She arrived 3 weeks ago. A healthy girl named Grace. "We're both doing well, thank you for asking." Emma exhaled with what sounded like relief. "That's wonderful. I'm so glad. I wanted to visit, but Richard said you preferred privacy, that you were managing fine and didn't need family involvement." The casual lie was so typical of Richard that Eleanor almost laughed. "That's not exactly accurate, Emma. Richard sent flowers and hasn't made contact since. But it's fine. Grace and I are managing perfectly well on our own." Another pause, longer this time. "I didn't know that. Richard said he'd been checking in regularly." "Eleanor, I'm sorry. I know how everything ended between you two, and I know our family wasn't always kind to you. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about how we treated you, and I feel terrible about it." Eleanor softened slightly, recognizing genuine regret when she heard it. "I appreciate that, Emma. Truly. But what's done is done. I'm focused on my daughter now, on building a life for her. The past is behind us." Emma's voice brightened with something like hope. "Could I meet her? Grace, I mean. I know I don't have any right to ask, but she's my niece, and I'd like to be part of her life if you'll let me." Eleanor considered the request carefully, weighing strategic value against emotional cost. Having Emma's involvement could provide useful intelligence about Richard's activities and family dynamics, but it also meant opening Grace's life to people who'd proven their capacity for cruelty. "Let me think about it, Emma. I need to protect my daughter, and that means being careful about who I allow into her world. But I appreciate you reaching out." They ended the call with Emma promising to respect Eleanor's boundaries, and Eleanor sat thinking about the complexity of human relationships, how the same people who participated in cruelty could also feel genuine remorse, how families could be both sources of pain and potential allies, depending on circumstances. Grace woke crying, and Eleanor lifted her from the bassinet, settling into the rocking chair to feed her while rain began pattering against the windows. The apartment was small but comfortable, filled now with baby equipment and the soft sounds of Grace's presence, transformed from the lonely space Eleanor had inhabited during her pregnancy into something that felt more like home. As Grace nursed, Eleanor's mind returned to the strategic plans, to the timeline that had been carefully constructed and was now unfolding exactly as designed. In 2 weeks, Chin Industrial Supply would complete its transition of Sterling Development's major suppliers, and Richard would start experiencing significant delays in material delivery that would push the Hancock Tower project further behind schedule. In 6 weeks, the credit line renewal would come due, and Eleanor's vote at Meridian Holdings would determine whether Sterling Development maintained its financing or faced the chaos of finding alternative lenders on short notice. Eleanor had decided to abstain from the vote rather than actively blocking the renewal, a more subtle approach that would create uncertainty without providing obvious evidence of opposition. Abstaining would trigger a review process at Meridian, a deeper examination of Sterling Development's financials that would reveal vulnerabilities and raise questions among other board members. The credit might still be renewed, but it would be grudging and conditional, with new restrictions that would limit Richard's operational flexibility and signal to the broader market that Sterling Development was considered risky. The approach was perfect because it damaged Richard while maintaining Eleanor's invisibility, creating problems that appeared to be consequences of his own business decisions rather than external attack. Would you have the discipline to take the indirect path when the direct one felt so much more satisfying? Would you have the patience to let problems develop naturally rather than forcing them prematurely? Morrison visited one afternoon, bringing documents for Eleanor to review and staying to meet Grace, his professional demeanor softening as he held the baby with surprising comfort. "She looks like you," he observed, gently rocking Grace, who'd begun fussing. Same determined expression, same intensity in her eyes even at 3 weeks old. Eleanor smiled, accepting Grace back and settling her against her shoulder. "Let's hope she inherits my patience along with my stubbornness. She's going to need both in the world we're building for her." Morrison's expression turned serious. "Speaking of which, there are developments you need to know about. Richard's wedding is scheduled for June 15th. Margaret's been planning it for months, apparently sparing no expense. Society pages are covering it extensively, treating it as the event of the season." Eleanor felt something twist in her chest, but kept her voice steady. "Let them celebrate. They'll have their perfect wedding, their perfect photographs, their perfect moment of triumph. It'll make what comes after even more devastating." Morrison nodded, pulling out a tablet to show Eleanor financial projections. The Hancock Tower delays are starting to trigger penalty clauses. Sterling Development has paid out nearly $2 million in late fees over the past month, and the project is still at least 60 days from completion. Meanwhile, 3 of their planned future developments are stalled because the properties they need have been purchased by other parties. Eleanor recognized the property purchases as ones she'd authorized through shell companies, strategic acquisitions that had seemed random but were actually calculated to block Richard's expansion plans. "How's Richard responding?" Eleanor asked, shifting Grace to her other shoulder when the baby began rooting for another feeding. Morrison's expression was grim. Publicly, he's projecting confidence. Privately, according to our sources, he's increasingly stressed. He's been in intense negotiations with suppliers, trying to understand why so many have suddenly shifted to other buyers. He's been meeting with banks about additional credit lines to cover the penalty payments. And he's been arguing with Margaret about the wedding costs, suggesting they scale back to preserve capital. Eleanor felt a grim satisfaction at that last detail. Richard arguing with his mother represented a crack in family unity, stress beginning to fracture relationships that had seemed unbreakable. Is Margaret agreeing to scale back? Morrison shook his head. From what we understand, she's refusing. Says the sterling reputation requires maintaining appearances, regardless of temporary financial pressure. She's convinced the business troubles are short-term, that Richard's just being overly cautious. Eleanor understood immediately how that dynamic would play out. Margaret's pride wouldn't let her acknowledge problems until they became undeniable, which meant she'd continue pushing Richard to maintain expensive appearances even as his financial situation deteriorated. The wedding would proceed exactly as planned, draining resources Richard couldn't afford to lose, all because admitting problems would mean admitting imperfection. "Perfect," Eleanor said quietly. "Let them have their expensive wedding. Let them celebrate and spend and show everyone how successful they are. It'll make the contrast even starker when everything falls apart." Morrison stood to leave, pausing at the door with something like concern in his expression. "Eleanor, I need to ask, are you certain about this path? Once we proceed to the next phases, there won't be opportunities to pull back. Richard and his family will face serious consequences, potentially losing everything they built. I need to know you're comfortable with that outcome." Eleanor looked down at Grace, now sleeping peacefully against her chest, her tiny face relaxed and trusting. She thought about the Christmas Eve dinner, about being thrown out pregnant into the snow, about Richard introducing his mistress, while Eleanor still wore her wedding ring, about the years of systematic cruelty disguised as family gatherings. They made their choices, Harold. They chose cruelty over kindness, power over compassion, appearance over integrity. I'm not creating their consequences. I'm just ensuring those consequences finally arrive. Morrison nodded slowly. Your mother would be proud of you, not for revenge, but for precision, the patience, the absolute refusal to let anger drive your decisions. You're executing justice, not vendetta, and that distinction matters. After he left, Eleanor sat in the quiet apartment with Grace, rain continuing its steady rhythm against the windows. The world outside going about its business, unaware that beneath the surface, a carefully constructed plan was reaching its final stages of preparation. In 6 weeks, Richard would marry Victoria in what would be remembered as one of the season's most elegant weddings. And approximately 2 weeks after that, when the honeymoon glow had just begun to settle and Richard believed his new life was firmly established, Eleanor's strategy would shift from positioning to action, from preparation to execution, from the calm before the storm to the storm itself. Eleanor kissed Grace's soft hair, breathing in the clean baby scent, feeling the weight of her daughter in her arms and the weight of decisions ahead in her heart. Your grandmother taught me that patience is power, Eleanor whispered. And your father taught me exactly where his weaknesses were, showed me every vulnerability, and gave me a complete map of how to dismantle everything he built. They both taught me important lessons, sweetheart. One taught me how to be strong. The other taught me why strength matters. Grace stirred but didn't wake, and Eleanor continued rocking gently, her mind already moving forward to the next phase, to the moment when silence would end and action would begin, when the powerless woman Richard had discarded would reveal herself as the most dangerous opponent he'd ever faced. June 15th arrived with a kind of perfect weather that seemed designed for Margaret Sterling's vision of triumph. Eleanor stood at her apartment window that morning, Grace sleeping peacefully in her arms, watching the city wake up beneath a cloudless sky. Somewhere across town, Richard was preparing to marry Victoria in what the society pages had been calling the wedding of the season for months. Eleanor felt nothing watching the sunlight spread across the buildings, no jealousy or longing. Just the calm certainty of someone who understood that today's celebration would become tomorrow's bitter memory. Grace stirred against Eleanor's chest, her tiny fist curling around Eleanor's finger with that surprising infant strength that never failed to move her. "Today your father gets everything he wanted," Eleanor whispered, kissing her daughter's soft hair. "The wedding, the perfect bride, the family approval, the photographs that'll hang in their hallway for years. And he has absolutely no idea that every smile, every toast, every moment of triumph is happening on borrowed time." Grace's dark eyes opened, unfocused, but somehow knowing, and Eleanor felt her resolve crystallize into something harder than diamond. Morrison had called earlier that week with the final confirmations. The credit line vote at Meridian Holdings was scheduled for June 29th, exactly 2 weeks after the wedding. Sterling Development's financial position had continued deteriorating throughout the spring. The accumulated pressure of supply delays, penalty payments, and stalled projects creating stress fractures that Richard was struggling to conceal. The Hancock Tower project was now 4 months behind schedule, with penalties exceeding $4 million. 3 major suppliers had completed their transition to Chin Industrial Supply, leaving Sterling Development scrambling for alternatives at significantly higher costs. And the property acquisitions Eleanor controlled had successfully blocked 2 development projects Richard had counted on for future revenue, forcing him to explore increasingly expensive alternatives. "He's holding everything together through sheer force of will," Morrison had explained during their last meeting, his tablet displaying financial analyses that painted a dire picture. "But it's unsustainable. The wedding expenses alone are draining resources he needs for operations." Margaret insisted on the plaza, insisted on the designer flowers, and insisted on flying in Victoria's entire family first class. "We estimate the total cost at somewhere between $800,000 and $1 million, money Sterling Development literally cannot afford to spend right now." Eleanor had smiled at that, understanding how perfectly Margaret's pride was serving her strategy. Would you bankrupt yourself to maintain appearances? Would you choose one perfect day over months of financial stability? The morning passed slowly, Eleanor feeding Grace and trying not to imagine the ceremony happening across town, the moment Richard would say vows to Victoria that echoed the ones he'd said to Eleanor 5 years earlier. Emma had sent a text that morning. "Thinking of you today. I know this must be difficult. The wedding is beautiful, but feels wrong somehow. Call me if you need to talk." Eleanor appreciated the gesture even as she recognized its futility. Emma couldn't understand that Eleanor didn't need comfort because Eleanor wasn't grieving. She was waiting, patient as winter, for the season to turn. Eleanor's phone rang just after 2 o'clock, an unknown number she almost didn't answer. Curiosity won, and she picked up to hear a familiar voice, tight with stress. "Eleanor, it's Richard." The sound of his name in his own voice, the first time she'd heard it since Christmas Eve, created a strange hollow feeling in her chest. "Richard, I'm surprised to hear from you. Shouldn't you be at your reception by now?" There was a pause filled with background noise, music, and laughter that confirmed he was indeed calling from his own wedding celebration. "I am. I just needed to call you. I needed to say something before I could fully move forward." Eleanor sat down carefully, adjusting Grace against her shoulder, her mind racing through possibilities. "What could you possibly need to say to me on your wedding day, Richard?" His breath came through the phone unsteady. "That I'm sorry for how everything ended, for the timing, for doing it the way I did on Christmas Eve. You didn't deserve that, Eleanor. You were a good wife, and I treated you terribly. I wanted you to know that I recognize that I regret how I handled things even if I don't regret the outcome." Eleanor felt anger rise like bile, hot and bitter. Have you ever received an apology that was really just another insult? Have you ever been told someone regrets hurting you but not leaving you? You're calling me from your wedding reception to apologize for humiliating me while I was pregnant with your child? Eleanor kept her voice level with effort. Do you have any idea how that sounds, Richard? Any understanding of how completely self-serving this call is? Richard's voice tightened defensively. I'm trying to do the right thing here, Eleanor. I'm trying to acknowledge my mistakes and clear the air between us. Victoria thinks it's important that we establish a civil relationship for Grace's sake, and I agree. Our daughter deserves to have parents who can communicate without hostility. Eleanor laughed, the sound sharp enough that Grace flinched against her. Victoria thinks it's important. Of course she does. The woman you were cheating with while married to me suddenly cares about healthy co-parenting now that she's got the ring she wanted. And you're calling me on your wedding day because your new wife told you to. Because clearing your conscience is apparently today's priority along with the cake cutting and the first dance. Richard's silence confirmed the truth of Eleanor's assessment. It doesn't matter why I'm calling. I'm trying to do right by Grace, try to set up a framework where we can both be part of her life without the poison of our failed marriage contaminating everything. You sent flowers when she was born and haven't made contact since, Eleanor said quietly, each word deliberate. You've paid your court-ordered support and nothing more. You haven't asked to meet her, haven't inquired about her health or development, haven't shown the slightest interest in being her father rather than just her financial obligation. So forgive me if I find your sudden concern about co-parenting somewhat less than convincing. Richard's voice rose with frustration. I've been busy, Eleanor. Building a business, planning a wedding, managing a complicated transition. I intended to reach out about visiting once things settle down. Eleanor stood and walked to the window, Grace warm against her chest, the city spread out below them like a map of futures yet to be written. Things are settled now, Richard. You're married. You got your perfect day. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to go back to your reception and enjoy every moment of it. You're going to dance with your bride and cut your cake and pose for your photographs. And then you're going to go on your honeymoon to wherever Margaret planned for you. And you're going to believe that everything worked out exactly as you wanted. She paused, letting the silence stretch. And when you come back, when reality sets in and the honeymoon glow fades, we'll talk about Grace and what kind of relationship you're actually capable of having with your daughter. But not today, Richard. Today belongs to you and Victoria. Enjoy it. She ended the call before he could respond, her hands shaking slightly as she set the phone down. Grace made a small sound and Eleanor rocked her gently, breathing deep to steady herself. The call had been unexpected but revealing, confirmation that even on his wedding day Richard remained fundamentally self-centered, unable to see beyond his own needs and desires. Morrison had been right about the strategy, about the timing, about everything. Richard was already feeling the pressure of his deteriorating business situation, already stressed enough that he was making impulsive decisions like calling his ex-wife from his wedding reception. The afternoon faded into evening, and Eleanor fed Grace, bathed her, and settled her for the night in the bassinet beside Eleanor's bed. The apartment was quiet except for Grace's soft breathing and the distant sounds of the city, peaceful in a way that felt earned rather than given. Eleanor's phone showed messages from Emma throughout the day, updates about the wedding that Eleanor read with detached interest. The ceremony was beautiful. Victoria looked stunning in Vera Wang. Margaret cried during the vows. The reception is at the plaza. Everything is perfect and elegant and exactly what you'd expect from the Sterlings. Perfect and elegant, Eleanor thought, built on money Richard didn't have and credit he was about to lose. In 2 weeks, the Meridian Holdings board would meet to vote on Sterling Development's credit line renewal. Eleanor would abstain, triggering the review process Morrison had predicted, creating uncertainty that would ripple through Richard's carefully constructed financial house of cards. And then, slowly but inevitably, everything would begin to unravel. Not dramatically, not all at once, but with the patient certainty of consequences finally arriving after being delayed too long. Eleanor climbed into bed, exhausted by the emotional weight of the day, Grace sleeping peacefully beside her. Your father had his perfect wedding today, Eleanor whispered into the darkness. Tomorrow he starts living with the consequences of every choice that made it possible. The Meridian Holdings boardroom occupied the 42nd floor of a glass tower in Midtown, its windows offering views that made everything below seem small and manageable. Eleanor had never seen the room in person, but Morrison's descriptions had been detailed enough that she could picture it perfectly as she sat in her apartment on June 29th, Grace napping in her bassinet, while Eleanor's phone sat on the desk displaying the calendar reminder. Credit vote, 2 p.m. The meeting was happening right now. 7 men and 2 women reviewing Sterling Development's financials, while Richard waited somewhere for news that would determine whether his company survived the summer. Morrison called at 3:15, his voice carrying satisfaction barely concealed by professional neutrality. It's done. You abstained as planned, citing potential conflicts of interest given your family connection to Sterling Development. The abstention triggered an automatic review as expected, and the discussion that followed was brutal. 3 board members raised serious concerns about Sterling's debt levels, the Hancock Tower penalties, and what they called troubling patterns in supplier relationships. The credit line wasn't denied outright, but it's being restructured with significantly tighter terms. Sterling Development will have access to roughly 60% of their previous limit, with monthly reporting requirements and covenants that restrict Richard's operational flexibility substantially. Eleanor felt something uncoil in her chest, the first tangible confirmation that months of careful planning were producing real consequences. How did Richard respond? Morrison's pause was meaningful. He wasn't in the room, but he's been informed by now. Our source on the board said the Meridian CEO called him personally to deliver the news. From what we understand, Richard tried to negotiate, argued that the restrictions were unnecessary and would hamper his ability to complete current projects. The CEO was sympathetic but firm. The board's position is non-negotiable. Eleanor closed her eyes, imagining Richard's face as he received that call, the careful control he'd maintain while his world tilted. What happens next? Reality, Morrison said simply. Sterling Development has projects underway that were budgeted assuming full credit availability. With only 60% of expected funding and the new restrictions, Richard will have to make impossible choices. Does he complete the Hancock Tower and risk running out of capital for other obligations? Does he pull resources from smaller projects to preserve the flagship development? Does he try to find alternative financing at rates that'll destroy his profit margins? There's no good answer, Eleanor. Every option leads to more problems. Eleanor opened her eyes and looked at Grace sleeping peacefully, her tiny chest rising and falling with perfect rhythm. Would you feel guilty watching someone drown if they'd pushed you into the water first? Would mercy for your enemy matter more than justice for yourself? The week following the credit restructuring brought the first visible cracks in the Sterling family's perfect facade. Emma called on July 2nd, her voice tight with worry that Eleanor had never heard before. Eleanor, something's wrong with Richard. He's been locked in meetings all week, barely sleeping. And when he is home, he's either silent or exploding over nothing. Margaret's trying to maintain appearances, but even she seems rattled. Victoria came back from their honeymoon expecting to move into their new penthouse, but Richard told her they need to delay the purchase. She's furious, and they've been fighting constantly. Eleanor made sympathetic sounds while her mind cataloged each detail, recognizing the pattern of stress fractures widening under pressure. Has Richard said anything specific about business problems? Eleanor asked carefully, keeping her tone concerned rather than curious. Emma hesitated before answering. He won't talk about it directly, but I overheard him on the phone with his CFO. Something about credit restrictions and cash flow issues and needing to restructure their project timeline. I don't understand the details, Eleanor, but I've never seen him like this. He's always been so confident, so completely in control. Now he looks haunted. Eleanor absorbed this information, understanding that Richard's carefully maintained mask was slipping, that the pressure was affecting him exactly as intended. I'm sorry he's struggling, Emma. Business challenges are difficult, especially when they come unexpectedly. Emma's voice dropped lower. Margaret thinks you're behind it somehow. She made some comment about the timing being suspicious, about your abstention at Meridian being calculated rather than ethical. I told her that was ridiculous, that you barely had time to think about Richard while caring for a newborn, but she seems convinced you're orchestrating something. Eleanor felt ice slide down her spine, the first indication that Margaret's instincts were sharper than expected. That's absurd. I have no influence over Meridian's lending decisions. If Richard's having financial difficulties, it's because of his own business choices, not anything I'm doing. Margaret's looking for someone to blame rather than accepting that sometimes things just don't work out as planned. The conversation ended with Emma apologizing for bothering Eleanor and promising to visit soon to meet Grace. Eleanor sat in silence after the call, considering the implications of Margaret's suspicions. The older woman's instincts were dangerous, but her lack of concrete evidence and Richard's pride would prevent them from investigating too thoroughly. Men like Richard couldn't accept that the woman they discarded could be powerful enough to threaten them, and that blindness was Eleanor's greatest protection. Still, she made a mental note to discuss additional security measures with Morrison, ensuring that the shell companies and corporate structures concealing her involvement remained impenetrable. July brought relentless heat and mounting pressure on Sterling Development. Morrison's regular updates painted a picture of systematic collapse, disguised as bad luck. The Hancock Tower is stalled again. Richard can't pay suppliers fast enough to maintain steady workflow with his restricted credit, so materials arrive sporadically and crews sit idle for days at a time. The penalties for late completion have now exceeded $6 million, with another month of delays likely. Meanwhile, 3 of his smaller projects have been suspended entirely because he's directing all available resources toward the flagship property, trying to salvage at least one success from wreckage. Morrison's tablet displayed financial projections that showed Sterling Development hemorrhaging money at an unsustainable rate. What about alternative financing? Eleanor asked, Grace in her arms, as she reviewed the documents Morrison had brought. He shook his head grimly. Richard's been trying. He's approached 4 different lenders over the past 2 weeks, but word has spread about Meridian's credit restructuring. When a major institutional lender loses confidence in a developer, other lenders notice. The few offers Richard's received have been at interest rates that would make his projects unprofitable even if completed on time. He's trapped Eleanor. He needs money to finish his current obligations, but can't access capital at rates that make business sense. Eleanor shifted Grace to her other arm, the baby's warm weight grounding her as she considered the trajectory of Richard's destruction. How long can he maintain current operations before something breaks? Morrison's expression was calculating. Another 6 weeks, at most. By mid-August, Sterling Development will face a crisis point. Either Richard finds significant new capital, which seems increasingly unlikely, or he defaults on obligations that will trigger catastrophic consequences. Contractors will file liens, investors will demand explanations, banks will call loans. The careful reputation Margaret spent decades building will collapse in a matter of weeks. Have you ever watched someone's empire crumble one brick at a time? Have you ever held power over someone who once held power over you? Victoria called on July 18th, her voice sharp with accusation when Eleanor answered. I know what you're doing. Eleanor kept her tone neutral, Grace fussing in the background. I'm sorry, Victoria, I don't know what you mean. I'm feeding my daughter and trying to manage my day. What exactly am I supposed to be doing? Victoria's laugh was bitter. Don't play innocent. The credit problems, the supplier issues, the property conflicts, all of it started around the time you received your mother's inheritance. Richard won't admit it, but I'm not stupid. You're sabotaging his business because you're bitter about the divorce. Eleanor felt anger flash hot and immediate. I'm bitter? You're the woman who slept with my husband while I was pregnant, who sat at Christmas dinner in my chair, who celebrated destroying my marriage. And now you have the audacity to call me and suggest I'm the problem in your life? Richard's business troubles are consequences of his own decisions, his overextension and poor planning. If you want someone to blame, look at the man you married. Victoria's voice rose. You're going to destroy everything we've built out of spite. Richard's reputation, his company, his family's legacy, all because you can't accept that he chose me over you. Eleanor stood and walked to the window, Grace quiet now against her shoulder. The city spread below them like a battlefield. Richard didn't choose you, Victoria. He chose his own immediate gratification over honor, responsibility, and basic human decency. You were just the convenient vehicle for that choice. And now you're learning what it costs to build a life on someone else's destruction. Enjoy your marriage, Victoria. Enjoy every moment of it, because you paid for it with your integrity, and you're about to learn that what you bought isn't nearly as valuable as you thought. She ended the call and blocked the number, her hands shaking with suppressed rage. Morrison visited that evening, his expression serious, as he settled into Eleanor's living room while Grace played on a blanket nearby. We need to discuss the next phase. Sterling Development is approaching collapse faster than initially projected. Richard's stress is affecting his judgment, causing him to make reactive decisions that accelerate rather than slow the deterioration. Within 3 weeks, possibly sooner, he'll face defaults that will essentially end his company as a functional entity. The question is whether you want to allow natural consequences to play out or if you want to intervene in some way. Eleanor looked at Grace reaching for a cloth book, her daughter's innocence a stark contrast to the calculations running through Eleanor's mind. What would intervention look like? Eleanor asked quietly. Morrison pulled out his tablet, displaying several scenarios. You could acquire Sterling Development's debt at a discount through shell companies, essentially becoming Richard's creditor and controlling his company's fate directly. You could offer financing that saves the company, but subordinates Richard to your terms. You could even let everything collapse, and then purchase the valuable assets from bankruptcy proceedings, rebuilding on the ruins of what he destroyed. Each option gives you different levels of control and different types of satisfaction. Eleanor studied the scenarios, weighing justice against mercy, recognizing that this moment would define not just Richard's future, but her own character and the example she set for Grace. Let it collapse naturally, Eleanor said finally, her voice steady with certainty. I won't save him, and I won't directly destroy him. I'll let the consequences of his own choices play out exactly as they would have without my involvement. He built his empire on arrogance and cruelty. Let it fall for the same reasons. Morrison nodded slowly, respect clear in his expression. Your mother would approve. She believed in inevitable justice, in letting people author their own destruction. I'll make sure we're positioned to observe but not interfere as events unfold. He stood to leave, pausing at the door. For what it's worth, Eleanor, you've handled this with remarkable restraint. Many people in your position would have chosen cruelty over justice. You've chosen the harder path. After he left, Eleanor sat with Grace in the quiet apartment, the baby finally asleep after an evening of unusual fussiness. Your father's world is ending, Eleanor whispered, stroking Grace's soft hair. Not because I destroyed it, but because he built it on sand and called it stone. Everything he valued, reputation, power, control, it's all slipping away because none of it was real. He mistook appearance for substance, and now he's learning the difference. Grace stirred but didn't wake, and Eleanor continued rocking gently, feeling the weight of decisions made and consequences approaching, knowing that within weeks the quiet patience that had sustained her through months of planning would finally yield the justice she'd been promised, the reckoning that Margaret had sensed but Richard had been too blind to see coming. August arrived with suffocating humidity that made the city feel like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Eleanor woke on the 7th to find 17 missed calls from unknown numbers and a text from Morrison that read simply, "It's happening. Call me when you're up." Grace was already awake, babbling contentedly in her bassinet, oblivious to the significance of the day her father's carefully constructed world would finally shatter beyond repair. Eleanor lifted her daughter, changed her, and settled into the nursing chair before calling Morrison back. Her heart steady despite knowing that this call would confirm months of patient strategy reaching its inevitable conclusion. Sterling Development defaulted on 3 major contractor payments yesterday, Morrison said without preamble, his voice carrying the weight of finality. The largest contractor filed a mechanic's lien this morning for $11 million. Two smaller contractors followed within hours. By noon, Sterling's primary bank had called an emergency review of all outstanding loans. Richard's been in crisis meetings since 6 a.m. trying to contain the damage, but there's nothing left to contain. The defaults triggered cross-default clauses in multiple loan agreements. Essentially, every creditor Sterling Development can now demand immediate payment, and Richard doesn't have remotely enough liquidity to satisfy even a fraction of those demands. Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the weight of this moment settle over her like snow. "What's the timeline for complete collapse?" she asked quietly, Grace's small hand wrapped around her finger with trusting strength. Morrison's tablet rustled as he pulled up projections. Bankruptcy filing within 2 weeks. Possibly sooner if Richard's lawyers convince him that it's the only way to protect what little remains. The Hancock Tower will be seized by the bank and sold to recover their position. Smaller properties will be liquidated in a fire sale that won't come close to covering outstanding debts. Sterling Development as an entity will cease to exist, and Richard personally guaranteed several of the loans, which means his personal assets are exposed. The penthouse Victoria wanted, the vacation property in the Hamptons, even the cars, and the art collection Margaret's so proud of, all of it's vulnerable to creditor claims. Eleanor felt something complicated twist in her chest, not quite satisfaction, but something harder to name. Have you ever gotten exactly what you wanted and found it tasted different than you imagined? Have you ever achieved revenge and wondered if victory was supposed to feel this heavy? What about Margaret? How is she handling this? Morrison's voice carried grim amusement. Publicly, she's maintaining appearances, telling anyone who'll listen that this is a temporary setback caused by market conditions beyond Richard's control. Privately, according to our sources, she's furious. She's been meeting with lawyers to determine how much of the family assets can be protected from Richard's business collapse. There's apparently significant tension between mother and son, with Margaret blaming Richard's management decisions and Richard blaming the market, the contractors, the banks, everyone except himself. Grace finished nursing and Eleanor lifted her to burp, the simple domestic rhythm grounding her as she processed the magnitude of what Morrison was describing. "Has Richard tried to contact me?" The question emerged before Eleanor could stop it, revealing a curiosity she hadn't known she felt. Morrison hesitated before answering. "Not directly, but Emma called our office yesterday asking if we knew how to reach you urgently. She said Richard wanted to talk to you about something important, that it was about Grace's future. I told her I'd pass along the message, but couldn't guarantee you'd respond." Eleanor felt anger flash hot. Grace's future. Now he cares about Grace's future, when his own future is disintegrating. Where was this paternal concern when he was spending $1 million on a wedding while his daughter needed diapers? The morning passed in a strange fog of normalcy punctuated by updates from Morrison as Sterling Development's collapse accelerated. At 10:30, news broke that the company had suspended all operations indefinitely. By noon, 3 major investors had filed suit seeking to recover their capital. At 2 o'clock, building inspectors arrived at the Hancock Tower and declared portions of the structure unsafe due to improper materials, adding regulatory complications to Sterling's already catastrophic financial problems. Each piece of news arrived like a hammer blow, systematic destruction of everything Richard had built, everything he'd valued more than his marriage, his wife, his unborn daughter. Emma called at 3, her voice thick with tears. "Eleanor, please, I know you probably don't want to hear from us, but Richard's in trouble. Real trouble. The company's failing, and he's going to lose everything. And I know he hurt you terribly, but he's still Grace's father, and I'm begging you to talk to him. He thinks maybe you can help, that maybe with your mother's money you could invest in Sterling Development. Save the company. I know it's a lot to ask after everything, but please, for Grace's sake if nothing else, please at least hear him out." Eleanor stood at her window holding Grace, looking out at the city where somewhere Richard was watching his empire crumble, finally understanding that consequences existed even for men who thought themselves untouchable. "Emma, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Eleanor said, her voice gentle but inflexible. Richard made choices. He chose to humiliate me publicly on Christmas Eve. He chose to introduce his mistress while I was pregnant. He chose to build a business on overextension and arrogance. He chose to spend money he didn't have on a wedding meant to celebrate my replacement. Every single one of those choices led directly to where he is now, and they were all his decisions, not mine. I'm not going to save him from the consequences he earned. Emma's breath caught. But Grace deserves a father who isn't destroyed. Don't you want your daughter to have financial security? If Richard loses everything, how will he pay child support? Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach. Grace has financial security. She has a mother who loves her and an inheritance that ensures her future regardless of what happens to Richard. What she doesn't have is a father who put her first even once, who considered her well-being before his own gratification. Richard had a chance to be the man Grace deserved. He chose differently. I'm not going to teach my daughter that women should sacrifice themselves to save men from their own failures, that we should pour our resources into propping up people who treated us as disposable. If Richard wanted my help, he should have treated me like I mattered when he had the chance. Emma started to respond, but Eleanor continued, her voice harder now. And, Emma, you need to understand something. Richard isn't calling because he suddenly cares about Grace's future. He's calling because he's desperate, and he thinks I'm weak enough to save him out of misplaced compassion or maternal instinct. He's still manipulating, still trying to use whatever leverage he can find. The fact that he's using his own daughter as that leverage tells you everything you need to know about his character. The call ended with Emma sobbing and Eleanor feeling hollowed out, the satisfaction she'd expected from this moment replaced by something more complex and difficult to process. Grace began fussing, and Eleanor walked her around the apartment, bouncing gently, humming softly, trying to quiet the storm of emotions churning beneath her carefully maintained composure. Morrison had been right that watching someone's destruction was different from planning it, that the reality of consequences carried weight that strategy sessions never captured. Richard was suffering, genuinely suffering, and some small part of Eleanor that remembered loving him once felt that. Suffering was like an echo of pain she thought she'd processed completely. Her phone rang again at 6, an unknown number she answered despite her better judgment. Richard's voice came through rough and desperate, stripped of the confident control she'd always known. Eleanor, please don't hang up. I know I have no right to ask you for anything. I know I destroyed whatever we had and hurt you in ways I can't take back. But I'm asking anyway because I'm out of options and I need help. Eleanor sat down slowly, Grace asleep now against her shoulder, the apartment golden with evening light. What exactly do you think I can do, Richard? His breath came fast and shallow. Invest in sterling development. You have resources, now real resources, enough to stabilize the company and give me time to restructure. I'll give you equity, control, whatever you want. I'll make you a partner, put your name on everything. Just please, Eleanor, please don't let me lose everything I've built. The desperation in his voice was so complete, so raw, that Eleanor felt something crack inside her chest. This was the man who'd thrown her out pregnant into Christmas snow, who'd smiled while introducing his mistress, who'd valued his pride more than her dignity. And now he was begging, offering her the control he'd once denied her, the partnership he'd never considered when they were married. Would you save someone who destroyed you if you had the power? Would mercy feel like strength or weakness in that moment? Richard, I want you to really hear what I'm about to say. The answer is no. Not because I'm cruel or vindictive, but because saving you would teach you nothing. You need to feel this, need to understand what it costs to treat people like they're disposable. You need to know that actions have consequences even for men born into privilege and protected by family money. Richard's voice broke. What about Grace? Don't you care that she'll grow up knowing her father lost everything that I couldn't provide for her? Eleanor felt anger flash bright and clean. Grace will grow up knowing her father valued his ego more than his family, that he chose pride over love, that when given the choice between doing right and doing easy, he picked easy every single time. Those are lessons you taught her, Richard, not me. I'm just refusing to lie to her about who you really are. She paused, letting the silence stretch. You know what the saddest part is? If you'd treated me with even basic respect, if you'd ended our marriage with dignity instead of cruelty, I might have helped you now. Not because you deserve it, but because Grace deserves to have a father who isn't destroyed. But you made that impossible when you made our divorce a public spectacle meant to humiliate me. You burned every bridge, Richard. This is just you finally noticing the smoke. She ended the call and blocked the number, her hands shaking as she held Grace tighter, breathing deep to steady herself. The apartment felt too small suddenly, too quiet, filled with the ghost of Richard's desperation and the weight of her own choices. Morrison had warned her that this moment would be complicated, that executing justice wasn't the same as feeling victorious, that sometimes getting everything you planned for left you questioning whether the plan had been right. Eleanor walked to the window and looked out at the city lights beginning to glow against the darkening sky. Hundreds of thousands of lives being lived in buildings she could see, each person carrying their own pain, their own choices, their own consequences. Your father called today, Eleanor whispered to sleeping Grace. He asked me to save him from the mess he created. And I said no. Someday, when you're old enough to understand, I'll explain why mercy without accountability isn't really mercy. Why saving someone from their consequences doesn't help them learn. I'll tell you that I chose your future over his comfort, your security over his pride, and that sometimes the hardest thing we do is refuse to fix what someone else broke. Grace's breathing stayed peaceful and even innocent of the destruction happening across town, the empire crumbling. The family that had seemed untouchable learning that nothing was permanent except the choices that defined who you really were when nobody was watching. Sterling Development filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy on August 15th, a Friday afternoon, when the news cycle was slow enough that the announcement made headlines across the business sections of every major newspaper. Eleanor read the reports while feeding Grace. The clinical language of financial collapse, reducing Richard's destroyed empire to numbers and legal terminology that felt disconnected from the human cost. The articles mentioned creditor claims totaling $73 million against assets valued at maybe $40 million in a for sale. They quoted industry analysts expressing surprise at how quickly a once respected developer had fallen. Speculation about mismanagement and overextension and market timing. None of them mentioned a pregnant woman thrown out on Christmas Eve, or a mother who taught her daughter that patience was power, or the months of careful strategy that had ensured consequences finally arrived for cruelty disguised as family dinner. Morrison visited that afternoon, bringing documents that confirmed what Eleanor had already assumed. Richard's personally liable for $22 million in guarantees he signed over the past 3 years. The bankruptcy will discharge most of Sterling Development's corporate debts, but his personal exposure remains. The house in Greenwich, the Hampton property, his investment accounts, all of it will be liquidated to satisfy creditor claims. Margaret tried to protect family assets through various legal structures, but most of Richard's wealth was tied directly to the company. He'll emerge from this essentially broken, his reputation destroyed, unemployable in the industry he dominated 6 months ago. Morrison paused, his expression careful. Victoria filed for divorce yesterday. She's claiming fraud. Says Richard misrepresented his financial position before their marriage. Her lawyers are arguing she shouldn't be held responsible for debts incurred through Richard's mismanagement. Eleanor felt something twist at that news despite everything. She's leaving him now? When he's at his lowest. Morrison's smile was grim. She married him for his money and status. Both are gone. What exactly did you expect her to do? Stand by him through poverty and humiliation? Victoria's not built for that kind of loyalty. Eleanor looked down at Grace, her daughter's innocent face a reminder of what real love looked like, the unconditional commitment that required no benefit beyond the person's existence. I guess she and Richard deserved each other after all. Both of them valued appearance over substance. Both believed love was transactional. Now they get to learn what that philosophy costs when the transaction fails. The following weeks brought a cascade of revelations that painted Richard's collapse in increasingly harsh light. Margaret gave an interview to the society pages claiming Richard had made decisions against her advice, that she'd warned him about overextension, but he'd refused to listen. The implicit message was clear. This failure belonged to Richard alone, not the sterling family legacy she'd spent decades protecting. Richard's former business partners released carefully worded statements, distancing themselves from his decisions, protecting their own reputations by sacrificing his. Friends who'd toasted his wedding in June were suddenly unavailable for comment, their silence more damning than any criticism. The speed with which Richard's social circle abandoned him was breathtaking, proof that the community he'd valued had never actually valued him, but only what he represented. Emma called in early September, her voice carrying exhaustion that went beyond mere tiredness. I went to see Richard yesterday. He's living in a studio apartment in Queens, everything valuable sold to pay creditors, surviving on what's left after the bankruptcy trustees take their share. Eleanor, he looks terrible. Like he's aged 20 years in 3 months. He barely speaks, barely eats, just sits staring at nothing. I tried to talk to him about fighting back, about rebuilding, but he acts like a man who's already given up. Eleanor felt a complicated swirl of emotions hearing this. The part of her that had loved Richard once aching for his pain, while the part that remembered Christmas Eve felt grimly satisfied that suffering had finally found the right address. What do you want me to say, Emma? That I feel sorry for him? I don't. I feel sorry for Grace, who'll grow up knowing her father chose ego over family. I feel sorry for everyone Richard hurt on his way to building an empire on sand. But I don't feel sorry for Richard learning that consequences exist even for people born into privilege. Emma's breath caught. You did this somehow, didn't you? I don't know how and I can't prove it, but the timing, the way everything fell apart so systematically, it doesn't feel like bad luck. It feels orchestrated. Eleanor's voice stayed level despite her racing heart. Richard did this to himself, Emma. He overextended his business, made poor decisions, trusted the wrong people, and believed his name would protect him from the realities everyone else faces. I didn't cause that. I just refused to save him from it. The conversation ended without resolution, Emma unconvinced, but unable to articulate her suspicions into anything concrete. Eleanor sat with Grace afterward, the baby now 4 months old and increasingly alert, her eyes tracking movement with focus that suggested intelligence already developing. People will always look for someone to blame when bad things happen, Eleanor told her daughter softly. They'll create conspiracy theories rather than accept that sometimes people fail because of their own choices. Your father's family thinks I destroyed him because accepting that he destroyed himself would mean acknowledging they raised someone fundamentally flawed. Grace grabbed at Eleanor's hair, pulling gently, and Eleanor smiled despite the weight of the conversation. But you'll know the truth, sweetheart. You'll know that I gave your father exactly what he gave me. Nothing but the consequences of his own actions. October brought the first cool days of autumn and the final legal settlements that closed the chapter on Sterling Development permanently. The Hancock Tower was sold to a competitor who'd complete the project under their own name, erasing Richard's legacy from the building he'd considered his masterpiece. The smaller properties were liquidated in sales that barely covered outstanding liens. Margaret's lawyers managed to protect some family assets, but the sterling name's association with failure and scandal meant even those victories felt hollow. Richard's personal bankruptcy was finalized, leaving him with essentially nothing except child support obligations that would follow him regardless of his financial situation. Morrison brought the final accounting to Eleanor's apartment on a gray afternoon, Grace sleeping in her swing while rain pattered against the windows. It's finished. Richard has no assets, no business, no prospects for employment in his former industry. He'll spend years, possibly decades, rebuilding from nothing while carrying the reputation of failure everywhere he goes. Margaret effectively disowned him. Emma's the only family member still maintaining contact. Victoria's divorce will be final next month with her claiming no responsibility for his debts and walking away clean. Morrison set his tablet aside and looked at Eleanor directly. You won, Eleanor. Completely and totally. You dismantled everything Richard valued, everything he chose over you, and he never even understood it was happening until too late to stop it. Eleanor looked at Grace sleeping peacefully, her daughter's face relaxed and trusting, and felt something settle in her chest that wasn't quite satisfaction, but maybe something closer to peace. I didn't win, Harold. I just stopped losing. There's a difference. Morrison frowned. I'm not sure I understand the distinction. Eleanor stood and walked to the window, watching rain transform the city into something softer and less defined. Winning would mean I got something valuable from all this. But what did I actually gain? Richard's destroyed, yes, but that doesn't heal the humiliation of Christmas Eve. His family scattered, but Grace still doesn't have a father who loves her. His empire collapsed, but my marriage is still gone, and I still spent months carrying a child alone, while the man who should have supported me celebrated with someone else. She turned back to Morrison, her expression serious. I executed justice, made sure consequences arrived, proved that patience and strategy can overcome arrogance and cruelty. But I didn't win anything except the satisfaction of knowing that people who hurt others eventually face those consequences. And honestly, Harold, that satisfaction feels thinner than I expected. Less like triumph and more like just ending a chapter that should never have been written in the first place. Morrison absorbed this quietly, understanding in his eyes. Your mother said something similar once. She told me that revenge was about balance, not victory. About making sure the scales were even, not about tipping them in your favor. She said true power was knowing when you'd done enough and walking away before justice became cruelty. Eleanor nodded slowly. She was right. I could keep going, could use my resources to make Richard's life even more miserable, could ensure he never recovers or rebuilds. But what would that teach Grace? What kind of person would I become if I let anger drive me past the point where consequences have been served? She returned to Grace's swing, adjusting the blanket around her sleeping daughter. Richard learned his lesson. He knows now that actions have consequences, that cruelty comes back around, that treating people as disposable eventually leaves you alone. Whether he becomes a better person from that knowledge isn't my responsibility anymore. My responsibility is raising Grace to understand power without abusing it, to value people over appearances, to know that strength includes knowing when to stop. Morrison gathered his documents, preparing to leave. What will you do now? You have resources, freedom, a daughter who needs you. The world's essentially open to whatever you want to build. Eleanor considered the question while watching rain streak down the windows, each drop following gravity's pull to inevitable conclusions. I'll raise Grace. I'll teach her everything my mother taught me about patience and strategy and dignity. I'll build businesses under my own name instead of hiding behind shell companies. I'll create something real and lasting instead of just tearing down what someone else built. And maybe eventually I'll forgive Richard. Not for him, but for me, because carrying anger is exhausting, and I'm tired of letting him occupy space in my thoughts. After Morrison left, Eleanor lifted Grace from her swing and settled into the rocking chair, her daughter stirring awake with soft sounds of contentment. Your father's story ended today, Eleanor whispered, stroking Grace's soft hair. He lost everything he valued because he never understood that the things he valued weren't actually valuable. Money, status, reputation, all of it disappeared the moment circumstances changed. But you and me, sweetheart, we're building something different. We're building a life based on things that last, love, integrity, knowledge, strength that comes from within rather than from what others think of us. Grace's eyes opened, dark and alert, seeming to understand in that mysterious way babies sometimes did. The evening settled into a comfortable routine, Eleanor feeding Grace, bathing her, singing softly while rocking her to sleep. The apartment felt peaceful in a way it never had before, as though some lingering tension had finally released with the closing of Richard's bankruptcy case. Eleanor's phone showed messages from Emma asking if they could talk, from Morrison confirming final details, from her lawyer about trust structures for Grace's inheritance. She'd answer them tomorrow, handle the practical necessities that life required. But tonight was for something simpler and more important. Tonight was for holding her daughter and understanding that the victory she'd achieved wasn't Richard's destruction, but Grace's future. Wasn't revenge, but justice. Wasn't about tearing down, but about building something better on ground that had been cleared of lies and cruelty. Have you ever achieved everything you planned for and realized the achievement mattered less than the person you became pursuing it? Have you ever won a war only to discover peace was what you'd wanted all along? Eleanor looked out at the city, lights beginning to glow as darkness fell. Thousands of windows illuminated with lives being lived, struggles being fought, choices being made that would echo forward into futures nobody could predict. Somewhere in that city, Richard was living with his consequences, learning lessons he should have learned decades earlier, facing the reality that cruelty eventually demands payment. And here, in this small apartment, Eleanor was living with her choices too. To seek justice without becoming cruel, to exercise power without abusing it, to remember that the point of strength was protecting what mattered rather than destroying what didn't. "We're going to be okay," Eleanor told Grace, her daughter now sleeping deeply, the peaceful sleep of someone who'd never known fear or humiliation or betrayal. "Better than okay. We're going to build a life where dignity matters more than dominance, where patience is recognized as strength, where being kind doesn't mean being weak. Your father taught me what not to value. Your grandmother taught me what to value. And you, my sweet girl, you remind me every day why any of this mattered at all." She kissed Grace's forehead, breathing in that clean baby scent that somehow smelled like hope and future and possibility. The chapter that had begun with Christmas Eve humiliation ended with autumn rain and sleeping innocence and the quiet certainty that justice, when executed with precision and restraint, didn't need spectacle or cruelty to be complete. Eleanor had endured, observed, planned, and acted. She dismantled an empire without raising her voice, destroyed a reputation without ever making her involvement known, taught powerful people that sometimes the person they dismissed as powerless was actually the most dangerous person in the room. And now, with Grace breathing softly against her chest and rain washing the city clean outside her window, Eleanor finally allowed herself to feel something beyond strategic calculation. She felt peace, hard-earned and precious, the peace of someone who'd faced their worst moment and transformed it into their defining strength, who'd been broken and had rebuilt themselves into something unbreakable, who'd learned that the sweetest victory wasn't destroying your enemies, but becoming someone your daughter could be proud of. The silent move Eleanor had made months ago, the patient strategy that had seemed like weakness to those who didn't understand power, had destroyed Richard and his family's arrogance exactly as planned. But more importantly, it had built something new. A mother who understood her strength, a daughter who'd grown up knowing women didn't need saving, and a future where Christmas Eve would be remembered not as the night Eleanor was destroyed, but as the night she began building something Richard could never take from her. That was victory, quiet and complete, the kind that didn't need witnesses or applause because the person it mattered to most already knew its value. Eleanor closed her eyes, held Grace close, and let the rain sing them both toward tomorrow. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling us the part of the story you enjoyed most.